The White House never really sleeps. At any hour, somewhere behind the walls, someone's working, watching, adjusting schedules, checking feeds. The lights dim overnight, but they never go out completely. Even at 4 in the morning, the West Wing hallways carry the low hum of air recyclers and the occasional shuffle of a security detail changing posts. My name is Daniel Kincaid. I've served in the Secret Service for 12 years. I've spent the last 6 of those in Washington, rotating through protective assignments, tactical support, and 2 years coordinating foreign travel operations. 1 year ago, I was promoted to lead the Presidential Protective Division. Since then, I haven't taken a full day off. There's no ceremony in this job. You show up, review the schedule, and start making plans for what can go wrong. My office sits 2 doors down from the West Wing Command Center. It's barely 10 feet wide, lined with monitors, and smells faintly of sweat, plastic, and old printer ink. The windows are bulletproof, sealed tight, and the walls are soundproofed. There are no clocks. We operate on shift rotations and digital briefings. You learn to wake up without alarms and fall asleep in chairs with your sidearms still on. That morning started like any other. I entered through the secure west entrance at 05:15. Badge check, retina scan, metal detector, then down the hall past a pair of uniformed Marines standing motionless at either side of the corridor. They nodded as I passed. I gave nothing back. You don't exchange pleasantries when the first thing on your schedule is a classified multi-agency briefing. The West Wing felt off. The usual banter between agents wasn't there. No one was talking about last night's game or laughing about the guy who fell asleep during the state dining room walkthrough. I passed 3 staffers hunched over a laptop in the Roosevelt room, whispering to each other with the blinds pulled down. I stopped by the command center to check the overnight reports. Agent Rowe was on duty. He glanced at me and nodded toward the monitor. His eyes were bloodshot, tie halfway undone. "Sit room. 10 minutes," he said. "You'll want to see this one." I didn't ask what it was. I just logged my arrival, keyed in my access code, and reviewed the inbound comms. Multiple incident reports flagged by the Department of Homeland Security. Most of it sounded like noise. Civil disturbances, riot dispersals, hospital lockdowns. Cities like Richmond, Baltimore, and Pittsburgh were all mentioned. The phrasing was vague. Unprovoked civilian aggression, unusual neurological symptoms. One report used the word quarantine twice and then had it redacted in the next line. By 05:55, I was seated inside the Situation Room. The air was cold and filtered. Half the screen wall showed infrared satellite overlays of the eastern seaboard. Red thermal clusters appeared over several cities. The other half showed direct feeds from federal buildings in DC, including the Capitol, FEMA headquarters, and Joint Base Andrews. I counted 4 faces already seated: Chief of Staff Warner, National Security Advisor Bledsoe, Defense Liaison Colonel Morton, and the Vice President's senior aide. Everyone looked more alert than usual, coffee cups untouched, no phones out. At 06 sharp, the President walked in with his press secretary and communications director. He wore a plain suit, no lapel pin, no folder in hand. He sat at the head of the table without greeting anyone and said, "Let's get to it." The CDC director came in through the side monitor. She looked tired, dark rings under her eyes, no makeup, hair tied back like she'd just left an emergency lab. "What we're seeing," she began, "is not viral in the traditional sense. It attacks the nervous system directly. Behavioral collapse, violent outbursts followed by rapid cardiac shutdown." The President leaned forward. "How fast does it spread?" Direct blood contact seems to be the main vector, but secondary exposure, saliva, open wounds, may also work. We don't know how long it survives on surfaces. Early estimates say as little as 20 seconds, but we've also recorded potential infections from contact with items removed up to 15 minutes prior. Colonel Morton spoke next. "Sir, Richmond is already unstable. Baltimore's seeing police withdrawals from hospital sectors. Emergency services are overwhelmed. State governors are demanding federal intervention." The Chief of Staff cut in. "We need to control the narrative. Get ahead of it before panic spreads. The president raised his hand to stop the room. What about DC? The NSA advisor brought up a live map. We've had isolated reports, mostly from ERs, urgent care centers. 2 EMTs were attacked last night. One report of a nurse being bitten. Unconfirmed. The word hung in the air for a second too long. I kept my eyes on the CDC director. Are these attacks rational? Are victims choosing to be violent, or are they reacting? She paused. It's not rational, and we've received 2 confirmed cases of reanimation after confirmed death. We're conducting full autopsies, but we don't expect normal pathology results. The president rubbed his temples. Containment plans? Quarantine zones in all affected cities, perimeter check-ins, mandatory screening. But we're behind the curve. People are fleeing urban centers. We've already got tailbacks on I-95 northbound. DC may be affected by noon. I spoke for the first time. I recommend we move the president's family to a secondary site before any press announcement is made. We'll secure the perimeter and prep both Marine One and the motorcade for evac. He nodded once. Good, make it happen. After the room cleared, I headed straight to the White House Command Center. I called my deputy, Agent Sarah Dray, told her to start immediate prep on the relocation protocol. That included alerting Camp David personnel, activating the airlift standby crews, and coordinating with Joint Base Andrews. She replied within seconds. Road traffic is jammed in all directions. Evac through city streets may not be viable. Try the river, I said. Pull the Potomac route file and get me a recon drone in the air. I'll get it done, she said. But you should know, Andrews just went dark on one of our channels. I stopped walking. Since when? 2 minutes ago. Blackout on one encrypted line, the other's static. I went silent, listening to the background noise of my own office. Printer humming, hallway phones ringing. I pulled the White House internal emergency frequency and tried to hail the backup channel for Joint Base Andrews. Nothing came back. Then Rose stepped into the office holding a padded envelope. Just delivered. Priority read. I opened it and pulled out 6 printed photographs. Hospital security camera captures, time-stamped and logged. The first showed a man in restraints on a gurney, eyes shut. The second showed his eyes open, monitor flatlining. The third showed him sitting up, jaws open, arms lunging toward a nurse. The last photo was red, blurry, and full of motion. I locked the envelope in the floor safe and walked to the East Room. The communications team was setting up cameras for the president's address. The lighting crew was already arguing about placement. Reporters would not be in the room. This was a closed-feed broadcast meant to calm the public and establish control. I pulled Dre aside outside the room. Any word from Andrews? Still nothing. We think a local override is scrambling the relay, or something worse. I was about to order a drone flyover when one of the exterior agents called in from the north fence. Multiple civilians approaching on foot, not armed, not speaking, just pushing against the gate. I asked for visuals. He sent a photo. 7 people, all adult, all standing shoulder to shoulder, hands on the bars. No bags, no signs. One had blood on her blouse. None reacted to the bullhorn warnings. I told him to stay back. Watch and report. Do not engage. By the time the president entered the East Room, the tension was thick. I stood just off camera with one comms line in my left ear and the secure internal line in my right. The lights came on. The red camera indicator blinked. The feed went live. The communications director had the manual cutoff within reach, but per protocol we could not kill a national address without a confirmed immediate threat inside the building. The policy was clear because an unsignaled cut would trigger public panic, evacuations, and road gridlock that would block emergency movement. We watched the perimeter reports and held the feed. The president started speaking, calm and measured, his voice filling the East Room through the broadcast system. He stood behind the podium, the national flag positioned just right behind his shoulder. the camera lights painting his face pale. I watched the small digital timer on the teleprompter count down as he read each line. Every sound in the room felt amplified. The faint click of a pen, the low buzz from a floor light, the rustle of a staffer shifting his weight. Behind my earpiece, the internal comms were filled with noise. Security reports, updates from the Secret Service motorcade, a few scattered requests for confirmation codes. It was all controlled chaos, the usual background of a high-level broadcast. But the tone was wrong. Voices were faster, clipped, nervous. Something was unraveling outside the walls. At first, it was just static mixed with Dre's voice. She was at the north gate, trying to keep civilians back. She said they were pressing against the fence, not speaking or reacting, even after warning shots in the air. I told her to hold position, to use the loudspeaker and back the team to the outer barricade. She answered, "Understood, but something's wrong with their movements. They're not responding at all. It's like they don't hear us." The comms popped with interference, then went quiet. I switched to the secure line, but her signal dropped mid-word. I looked toward the hallway doors, expecting someone to enter with a message, but no one came. The president continued his speech, talking about safety, calm, and resilience. He said the government was working with state authorities to contain a series of violent outbreaks. He used the phrase, medical emergency, twice. The communication director nodded approvingly each time. The staffers stood still, pretending this was just another day of national reassurance. No one in that room believed a word of it anymore. The moment his speech mentioned containment, my earpiece cracked again with a voice from the perimeter command post. Agent Miles. His tone was controlled but urgent. "Sir, contact at the west gate. Multiple hostiles approaching fast, ignoring commands. One's down but keeps moving." I said, "Say again?" "Down but still moving, sir. We need authorization for lethal engagement." I didn't answer immediately. My eyes stayed on the president as he spoke, as if nothing outside those walls existed. The red indicator on the camera still glowed, meaning the feed was live. Breaking into that broadcast without direct cause would trigger national panic. Still, protocol meant nothing if our perimeter fell. I pressed my earpiece tighter and said, "Use lethal force. Confirm target elimination and report." He responded with one word, "Copy." Then the sound of gunfire burst through the line, short and fast. The audio spiked with shouts, then cut. The next 30 seconds inside that room stretched forever. The president kept reading from the teleprompter, his words slipping between scripted comfort and forced control. The cameraman adjusted focus. The communications director's eyes darted toward me once, probably reacting to the faint gunfire that echoed through the building's walls. It was distant, muffled, but unmistakable. The president didn't seem to notice or pretended not to. Then, right as he began the final paragraph, the power flickered. The overhead lights dimmed, screens in the back blinked black, and the camera feed froze. I saw the image glitch on the monitor for half a second before everything stabilized. He hesitated only a breath before finishing the last sentence. "We will remain strong as a nation and face this challenge together." As soon as he stepped away from the podium, I received a short encrypted ping from the communications hub. "Emergency broadcast suspension. Executive decision required." That message was automatic. It meant the signal was unstable or compromised. The president didn't even get to leave the room before the staffer nearest the door stumbled, catching herself on the frame. She muttered something about dizziness and reached for her temple. Another aide moved to steady her. I crossed the floor fast, pushing through the camera stand. Her breathing was shallow, and there were small red streaks under her nose. I ordered the medics through the earpiece and told the others to clear the area. Within seconds, she went limp. The medic tried to call her name, then lifted her sleeve to check for a pulse. There was a bite mark high on her forearm, shallow, but old enough that blood had dried. The room turned silent. The cameraman backed up, hitting his equipment case. The president froze halfway between the podium and the exit, watching. I gave the medic a direct order. "Isolate her. No contact without gloves." She was moved onto a gurney and wheeled toward the service corridor. I followed halfway, long enough to see her body start twitching. The medic asked if we should restrain her. I told him to do it and report the moment she stopped breathing. He nodded and vanished down the corridor with 2 guards. The communications director insisted the broadcast be cut short for technical failure. The president didn't argue. He was escorted out by 2 detail agents and moved toward the situation room for an immediate debrief. As we walked, I could hear distant shouting from above ground, faint, chaotic, not close yet. When we reached the secured elevator, I pressed the emergency override to seal after us. The president asked if the noise was coming from the protesters. I told him no. I told him it was something else. When the elevator reached the lower level, I keyed the code and waited for the double door seal to open. The situation room was half lit, monitors switching between feeds as the satellite uplinks dropped in and out. On the primary screen, the CDC director was already waiting on video. Her tone was flat, no trace of professional restraint left. She said the pathogen caused near-complete neurological loss within minutes, death in less than an hour, and reanimation immediately afterward. She used that word clearly, reanimation. The president asked if it was a mutation or an engineered agent. She didn't answer directly, just said their labs were destroyed in an incident during containment procedures. The defense liaison broke in through the secondary feed from the Pentagon. He said the guard was being deployed along the Potomac bridges, but half the units weren't responding to radio. He mentioned civilian panic near the mall, fights breaking out near the evacuation checkpoints. No one used the word zombie. Not yet. They called them infected civilians, reanimated casualties, or just contacts. The president demanded to know if the Capitol and Pentagon were secure. The liaison paused before answering. That pause said everything. The president ordered immediate lockdown of the White House and all federal installations in D.C. I relayed the command to the perimeter teams. Every gate sealed, fences electrified, outer roads closed, and the National Guard authorized to fire on sight. By then, the main communication grid was already failing. Some radio towers were losing power. Military frequencies started bleeding over one another. When I checked our internal line again, half the agents weren't responding. The North team, Dre's unit, was completely silent. I called her repeatedly, but there was no return ping, no voice, not even static, just silence. The president kept asking if the family had reached Camp David. I couldn't give him an answer. I had no confirmation of their transport. The comms hub in Andrews was unresponsive, and the Marine One crew was off-grid. That meant our extraction point was gone. The president's chief of staff started pacing, muttering about public control and continuity of government. He asked if we should pre-record a second speech for when communications stabilized. The president stared at him for a long time, then said, "Who's going to broadcast it? There might not be anyone left to watch." The line hit hard, and no one replied. I excused myself from the situation room and moved to the command corridor. The air there was dry, humming from the backup generator. I took a team of 3 agents and went to check the infirmary where the bitten agent from the outer perimeter had been placed earlier. The hallway leading there smelled of disinfectant and gun oil. When we reached the door, the lights flickered. Inside, the bed was overturned, the sheet empty. Blood streaks ran along the floor toward the back exit. One of the agents whispered that the room had been sealed 20 minutes ago. I looked at the door mechanism. It wasn't forced open. Someone had entered using proper clearance. We followed the trail down the hall and found the guard at the corner. He was slumped against the wall, neck torn open. His sidearm was missing. I checked his radio. Dead battery. The others wanted to call it in, but I told them to move quiet and check the next corridor first. When we reached the lower stairwell, something moved below us. Slow at first, then a scrape against concrete. I leaned over the rail and saw what used to be the agent, face half grey, eyes pale, blood caked down his chin. He moved fast when he saw us. I ordered the others back, raised my weapon, and fired a controlled pair. The body dropped on the first shot, but didn't stay down until the second hit the head. We secured the area and dragged the body into a containment closet, locking it from the outside. One of the agents whispered that the man had been his friend. I told him to stop thinking about that. We had a job, It sounded cold even to me, but that was the only way to keep the rest focused. When I returned to the Situation Room, the president was sitting at the table with his jacket off. He looked pale but steady. The CDC feed had gone dark, replaced by a Pentagon command interface that showed unit positions around the city. Most markers had switched from green to red. The defense liaison's voice was still calm, but every update made it worse. Barricades failing, civilians breaching checkpoints, helicopters rerouted to unknown coordinates. One last transmission came from Andrews. Medical collapse confirmed, base compromised, then static. The president stood and told everyone to take a moment. The staff left, leaving just him and me. He asked if I believed the country could still function after this. I told him yes, because it was the only answer he needed to hear. He stared at the map on the screen for several seconds, then said we'd stay inside the White House bunker until we knew where to go next. I wanted to argue. The filters were old, the rations limited, and the air system barely fit for a week of use. But I said nothing. We all lied to ourselves that day, hoping someone higher up had a plan. The bunker lights buzzed softly overhead, pale and constant, giving everything a washed-out glow. The president sat motionless at the long table while the low drone of the generator filled the background. The others had cleared out, leaving a half-empty pot of coffee and an untouched stack of documents near the end of the table. I leaned against the wall, checking the service pistol at my hip. The silence was heavy. For a few minutes neither of us spoke. The monitors in front of us flickered between feeds, some still from outside, others looping static. Every so often one of them cut to a live view of the streets near the Ellipse or the Potomac Bridge. Each time the image sharpened, there were fewer lights visible in the distance. The president finally broke the quiet and said he wanted a full inventory of the shelter. I radioed Agent Rowe, who was already 2 levels below us in storage, and told him to count everything: water, food, fuel, ammunition, medical kits, oxygen cartridges. I could hear him breathing hard through the radio. He said, "Half the crates are expired, sir. The labels show 2015. I told him to keep counting, and not say that number again in front of the president. Sarah Dre arrived a few minutes later, helmet off, jacket open, her face streaked with dirt. She looked like she had run straight from the perimeter. Her voice stayed calm, but her eyes were shaking with adrenaline. She reported that the outer teams had fallen back inside the walls. Contact was lost with every unit outside the north fence. I asked how many personnel we had left inside the compound. She said, 37 active, including staff and communications. That meant we had already lost more than half the rotation. The president listened from the far end of the room without interrupting. When she finished, he asked how long the bunker could remain sealed. I told him the filters might last 48 hours, 72 if we cut air recirculation intervals. He nodded and said, "Then we make 72 work." His voice was steady, but his expression said something else. The man looked cornered for the first time since I had known him. We initiated Lockdown Protocol Alpha, which meant no movement between levels without two-person authentication, every access point sealed, and all power routed through the secure generator grid. The ventilation system was turned down to 50% capacity. The air grew heavier within hours, and the hum from the fans dropped to a faint whine. The technicians monitoring the feeds said the perimeter cameras were dying one by one. Each blackout came with a faint clicking noise through the speakers. When I leaned closer, I realized it wasn't a malfunction. It was movement near the mics, something brushing against metal. At 0100 hours, we lost the last exterior feed from the north lawn. The screen turned grey for 2 seconds, then black. Dre stood behind me watching the display. Her voice dropped low when she said, "They're inside the grounds." I wanted her to be wrong, but deep down, I knew she wasn't. We sealed the elevator access to the ground floor and posted 2 agents at the secondary blast door. The president had moved into the inner conference room by then, speaking with the defense liaison through the remaining stable channel. The liaison's voice came through distorted, filled with static and digital interference. He mentioned that the Pentagon was preparing for evacuation, but couldn't guarantee extraction for at least 8 hours. The president told him he would wait. When the call ended, he looked at me, and said he didn't want anyone else in or out. I walked with Dre through the service corridors to check the emergency supply lockers. The concrete walls were slick with condensation, and the smell of metal filled the air. We passed a few staffers sitting against the wall, whispering. One woman was crying quietly into her sleeve. Nobody tried to comfort her. People were already turning inward, processing fear in silence. Dre stopped near the generator room door and whispered, "If this keeps spreading, we're not making it out of here." I didn't answer. There was nothing useful to say. The next 2 hours dragged by. I tried to keep my focus by running drills. We rotated guard posts every 30 minutes. I checked ammunition counts, recalibrated the comms frequencies, reviewed entry points. Every so often, I'd hear faint thuds from above, not explosions, just dull impacts, slow and uneven. The sound traveled down through the air shafts. I caught Dre listening too. She looked up and asked what it was. I said, "Probably debris." We both knew it wasn't. By 03:30, the bunker atmosphere had changed completely. Sweat clung to everything. The air vents hissed weakly. Several staffers were coughing, not from illness but from stale oxygen. The medic came to me and said the filters needed replacement, but the new ones were stored near the upper maintenance access. I told him to forget it for now. He said, "Sir, that system won't hold." I stared at him until he lowered his head and walked away. I couldn't risk sending anyone topside yet. We ate ration bars for breakfast. Nobody talked. The president sat near the far wall with his aides, reading a printed statement. His chief of staff had been trying to reach FEMA's central command through a backup phone, but the line never connected. Every now and then, the phone buzzed once with what sounded like feedback from another channel. Screaming, a siren, then static. He stopped trying after the 5th attempt. Around 0440, the Situation Room feed reconnected for several seconds, just long enough to show what was left of the North Corridor. Smoke filled the frame. A uniformed guard was visible on the ground, crawling toward the camera. His legs were gone below the knees. He reached out, eyes wide, then disappeared from view as something dragged him backward. The feed cut to black. No one said a word. The technician simply unplugged the monitor and turned off the power switch. I went to check on the armory, which was only half stocked. Most of the heavier weapons were still locked upstairs in the West Wing armory, beyond the sealed doors. We had sidearms, a few carbines, and enough ammunition for maybe 2 firefights. Dre walked beside me, reviewing the manual code for the inner hatch. She said, "We can't stay down here waiting. If the air goes, we'll suffocate before anything reaches us." I told her the president wasn't moving until the Pentagon confirmed extraction. She exhaled sharply and said, "Then he's going to die down here, and we'll die with him." I told her to keep her voice down. The walls had ears, and panic spreads faster than infection. At 0500, Agent Rowe returned from inventory with a clipboard. He said we had enough sealed rations for 5 days if we rationed hard. The president's aide asked if that included water. Rowe hesitated before saying yes. I caught the pause but didn't call him on it. Lies were easier than truth by then. The president's son was trying to call from a private residence in Maryland. His voice cracked through the emergency phone once before cutting off completely. The president slammed the receiver down, then composed himself and walked back to his seat. I pretended not to notice the tremor in his hand. Leadership has a way of looking composed even when everything is gone. We finally heard movement above the bunker at 0620. It came from the elevator shaft, faint scraping metal against concrete. At first, I thought it was debris shifting. Then I heard something hit the upper blast door, once, then twice. A pause followed, and the sound came again, faster. Dre raised her weapon automatically. The others froze. The president asked what it was. I said, "Maybe someone trying to get in." He said, "Who?" I didn't answer. I ordered Rowe and another agent to check the access camera feed. The image showed the inner side of the elevator gate, dark and still. Then a shape passed across the lens, jerky and fast. The technician leaned closer, adjusting focus. The figure looked human at first, but its head moved wrong, twitching from side to side. eyes reflecting white against the camera light. Then the feed went out again. Dre turned to me. "They're in the elevator shaft," she said quietly. I nodded. "Seal it. Power off the lift and lock the access grid." She relayed the command, and the technician began typing codes, hands shaking. The steel shutters closed over the screen with a solid clunk, and the sound above us faded. The president called me to his office soon after. He wanted an update. I told him the outer compound had fallen, that we were officially cut off from all government branches. He asked if I could guarantee his safety. I said I'd do my best. He stared at me for a while, then asked what best meant. I didn't answer that either. The bunker settled into a grim routine through the next few hours. Guards rotated. The medic monitored air levels. The president dictated notes for a potential public address that would never be aired. I checked the locks every half hour. Time started to lose meaning. The only clock that mattered was the air gauge on the filtration unit, and the needle was sinking. At 07:15, a muffled explosion rolled through the ground above us. Dust drifted from the ceiling. The generator lights flickered once. Rowe looked at me from his post. He didn't ask. He just waited for me to say something. I told him to hold position and watch the door. When I walked back toward the situation room, I caught Dre standing near the stair access, whispering to herself. She wasn't praying. She was counting breaths. It's a trick we use to keep focus when everything's falling apart. That was when the power grid started to fail. The backup generator sputtered once, then again. The monitors dimmed to half brightness. The hum of ventilation grew weaker. A metallic groan came from somewhere deep in the structure, echoing down the hall. Dre said softly, "If the power dies, those doors won't hold." I checked my weapon and said, "Then we'll make sure they don't get close enough to test them." The president was still awake, pacing slowly near the end of the hall, jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled up. His face was grey in the emergency light. He looked at me and said, "You think anyone's coming for us?" I said, "Someone will try." He nodded once, quietly repeating the words, as if trying to believe them. The sound of the first impact against the inner door came right after that. Not loud, just a heavy metallic thud. Then another, closer. The staff froze. The president looked toward the corridor, eyes fixed. Dre raised her rifle and signaled the others to form up behind the barrier. I moved to the front, keeping my weapon low, finger ready. The hits came again, faster this time. Something on the other side was testing the seal. The next impact was the sound of a door being forced from the other side, not a pounding, but a wedging, slow and brutal, followed by shouts and a single sharp scream that cut the air and made everyone flinch. The barrier we had put up held for a moment, then something hit it so hard that the lights above the corridor flickered. I kept my weapon down but ready, eyes scanning faces, counting exits, watching hands. Dre was at the front of the line with her rifle up, jaw tight, the strap of her helmet digging into the back of her neck where sweat had already made her hair damp. The president had his hands on the table and was breathing with the same rhythm as the generator, which made him look steadier than he felt. Security shouted orders into microphones. The pounding paused. A wet scrape sounded on the other side, and then one of the agents at the barrier yelled that someone had breached the outer perimeter and made it into the service corridor. "Hold the line," I said, because the words snapped the group back into motion even as my head catalogued the next steps. Seal doors, move VIPs deeper, isolate anyone exposed. We moved down the service corridor in a single file, the few of us assigned to immediate response, and we hit the stairwell that leads to the maintenance wing. The lights there were dim, on a half-power setting, and the shadows were long and blunt. Around the second landing, a junior officer came running up with blood on his sleeve and a wild look in his eyes. He staggered and nearly lost it in front of me. His uniform was torn, his name tag bent, and he kept repeating, "It turned, it turned." I grabbed his shoulders and felt the tremor in his arms. Behind him, another man, one of the custodial staff, was pinned against the wall by two other agents. The custodian's face was slack in places where it used to be expressible, and his hands were clawed in a way that didn't line up with normal pain. Before I could sort orders, The first junior officer lurched forward and then dropped to a knee, coughing, and then his face contorted and his body went still. One of the agents shoved him to the floor, and the man started to move again, crawling fast with no sense of direction. I fired once, center mass, because that is the commanded response to a lethal threat inside a secured environment. The man stopped moving and then did not. We secured the area and moved quicker after that, not talking except to pass confirmations over the encrypted net. By the time we reached the infirmary, the layout of the day had changed. The room was a controlled chaos of kit and sterile light, but the medic on duty had the look of someone trying to organize a disaster with a paper checklist that was already obsolete. He introduced himself, Captain Lewis from the Air Force Medical Detachment, practically in a single breath, and he scanned the faces around him with a practiced calm. He said, "We secured the wounded. One is symptomatic, but we've done vitals, and the initial labs don't show systemic failure yet. We'll isolate and monitor." His hands were steady. He read the charts fast and used words meant to keep panic away. Stabilize, observe, quarantine. Then, someone shoved a stretcher through the door, and the president stepped forward as if drawn, not because he was supposed to be there, but because he was human, and people looked toward the most fragile person to measure what's happening. That's when I saw the scratch on his forearm, small, half hidden where the sleeve had been rolled back. It looked like nothing at first, not even deep, just a shallow abrasion with a thin, dark line along the skin. The president didn't flinch when I pointed it out to the medic, but his hand closed for a second as if checking it himself. Captain Lewis leaned in close, palms up as if asking permission for a quick exam, and he smiled in a way that was meant to diffuse the tension. He said, "This is superficial. No penetration of the dermis. Surface abrasion from grass or metal. We'll clean it, apply antiseptic, and monitor. He's under observation for 24 hours. The way he spoke contained the exact phrases you want to hear. Cleaning, antiseptic, monitor. The president let him touch the arm, kept his face impassive, and the room breathed a little easier, because medical language provides a kind of temporary shelter. I watched the medic's fingers as he worked, and I watched the president's eyes when no one else could see them. They were steady and sharp, not blank. When the medic finished, he stepped back and told the president to rest while they ran a full panel. Then, as if to close the loop on something everyone wanted closed, Captain Lewis said in the same confident tone, "We should get him to Air Force One as soon as possible. Best protection is isolation and movement." The phrase landed in the room and rotated slowly. Air Force One in that bunker felt like both a plan and a prayer. Logistics cracked open like frost underfoot. Air Force One is not a generic airframe you can call on and expect to appear instantly. It is a full team, specialized crew, a maintenance detachment, a fuel plan, a secure flight path cleared by controllers, and at least 2 qualified relief pilots awake and on station. Moving the president requires an order through the National Military Command, signatures, the safe route cleared, and the aircrew briefed on the nature of the threat. Captain Lewis pressed the point because medical evacuation under a credible biological risk changes priorities. Movement to a secure, well-equipped aircraft reduces local exposure and places the patient under an enclosed, controlled environment with a medical team on board. He said, "We'll need clearance, a ground escort, and a secure taxi route to Andrews. I'll coordinate triage for the staff who'll accompany him." He kept using "we." It made sense. He was a professional and his words gave us a script to follow, but there was no guarantee it would carry weight when pressure came. I radioed to the command liaison and asked for immediate authorization for Air Force One to launch. The line was full of static and half-formed transmissions, someone shouting coordinates, an operator cutting through with a code, then nothing. I repeated the request on a second channel and got an auto-response that said the Andrews relay had been compromised and gave a priority contact at the Pentagon that went to a loop of recorded tones. I told the president what I could, not the panic, but the procedural truth. "I'll try to get you on Air Force One, but I need clearance from Andrews and the flight line." He heard me and nodded, because you answer the man guarding you with the same calm you aim to show your family. Behind us, a technician at a console tapped a frequency and got a terse voice. It was the defense liaison. He said the same thing in fewer words. Andrews was under local lockdown. The ground crew were unaccounted for, and the backup fuel trucks hadn't reported in. He added, "We can still attempt to marshal an aircraft, but it will be a risk. The flight crew needs a minimum crew complement and ground support. If we send it, it may not be able to return." The president listened, and then, because he is a man used to making decisions when things are unknown, he asked what options we had besides waiting in this bunker. I laid out the choices as clinically as I could. We could attempt to move him to Air Force One immediately if we could secure a ground escort and confirm that the aircrew was available, but we risked moving into contaminated zones. We could isolate here, strictly control contact, and try to hold out until clearer orders arrived, but our filtration and food were limited. Or we could attempt a local extraction to a nearby military facility, but all nearby facilities reported complications, chaos at ports, confusion at state defense commands, and inconsistent radio traffic. The president looked from one of us to another, his jaw set, and finally said he wanted to try Air Force One. He said, "If there is a way to get me airborne, do it. My priority is the continuity of government and the safety of my family." There was no flourish in the delivery. It was a directive in a moment when directives were their own kind of life support. Captain Lewis agreed to prepare the president for immediate movement, insisting on a full decontamination kit and a closed transport. He assigned medics to pack a single grab bag with the essentials: bandages, antibiotics, sterile dressings, an automated external defibrillator, and a sealed sample pack for whatever tests could still be run in transit. He also requested a small escort team with clearance to use lethal force if the perimeter breached during the move. I assembled a hand-picked group: Dre, Rowe, 2 senior agents and myself, because in that moment there was no room for less. I told the team the plan and reminded them of rules of engagement and contamination protocol. Someone asked what the timeline was, and I said the only timeline that mattered was how fast we could confirm a safe runway. Captain Lewis said, "If the scratch on his arm is superficial, this will be a drill in containment. If not, we keep moving and isolate his contacts. But we'll make sure he's on an aircraft with a medical isolation bay." We all heard the "if" and knew what it meant without saying the rest. The first obstacle arrived as a factual, bureaucratic thing: names and keys. The presidential aide who handles flight clearance and manifests could not be contacted. The holdover communications team tried to push a flight plan through, but the FAA feed returned only partial acknowledgements and then dropped. On another frequency, a pilot with a clipped voice confirmed he was en route, but then the line vanished. The defense liaison simultaneously reported that a pair of Marine One crews had failed to report for duty, and that one ground maintenance unit was unresponsive. Every single node we needed to pull the aircraft out of a hangar and into the air had a hole in it. I told Captain Lewis that I would break the problem into smaller, solvable pieces: get the manifest, confirm crew, secure the taxi route, and establish a local ground escort. He nodded and said, "I'll get the med team ready to move and try to get a live sample to the lab on the way. If we can confirm no systemic infection, we can justify immediate transfer." His logic was correct. The problem was that the rest of the world was not playing by rules. People around us began to whisper the word contagion more often, each time softer, as if speaking it might make it true. I kept my answers procedural because the job rewards precision even when everything else is fuzzy. I made calls through the few channels that still responded and watched the president while the medic cleaned the small mark on his arm. He followed the routine without comment, but his eyes tracked every movement in the room. Captain Lewis finished, applied a dressing and said, "We'll run on the assumption this is superficial and proceed accordingly. If anything changes, we quarantine immediately." I stayed on clearances, manifests, escorts, and a route that would not collapse under the first detour. As I worked, I kept an eye on the ventilation gauges and Rowe's inventory sheet. Filter life slipped again. Ration counts fell once we added staff now symptomatic. Nothing balanced. Lewis stayed beside the president and asked for 2 more medics and a security detail with hazmat certification. I said I would try. He called the base med desk and said, "We need a med evac crew ready to isolate the president and staff for transport to Air Force One. Ground escort to Andrews. Confirm fuel and flight crew." The call connected. He took a short response. Then the line died. He rubbed his forehead and tried to look steady for the rest of us. We had a plan that might work if every element aligned. We had a med assessment that suggested the president's scratch was minor. We had a chain of command telling us to move, and we had a reality where command lines were fraying. I collected the list of names we needed, the codes we had to input, and the equipment that would have to move. The president stood and, in a voice low enough to be a private order, said, "Do what you must. Get me airborne." The man asked for one thing, and the request had the weight of a command because whatever else collapsed, that was still the thing he could do that mattered. I said I would try, because trying is what keeps you moving when every fact points toward failure. We moved into motion and into the paperwork of survival, which is where institutions go to argue while people act, and I began to pull threads that might still hold a small plan together. We set the plan in motion with the kind of awkward efficiency that comes from people used to following checklists even when the checklists are missing pages. My first task was to pin down a flight crew and confirm that an airframe could be readied without the usual handoff from Andrews, because Andrews was not answering on any of the secured channels. I called the Pentagon, NORAD, Joint Base Andrews Alternates, and an AFOZ emergency channel. The first three gave clipped automated messages or static. On the fourth, a maintenance lead at Andrews said, "We have crews KIA or gone, sir. Fuel truck stalled. If you can bring your own ground escort and fuel, we can try to get an airframe airborne, but it will be slow." He sounded tired and honest. I kept his line open and started a bare-bones manifest from what still worked. Lewis moved fast. He finalized the grab bag, assigned 2 medtechs, checked instruments, and wrote an immediate care checklist in block letters. He said, "We'll run baseline blood panels right before movement. If we see elevated markers or agitation, we abort." I told Rowe to ready the motorcade and ground escort. Rowe reported the armored cars were good, but Andrews' fuel trucks were delayed, and state checkpoints were redirecting traffic. The route might not be clear when we needed it. We committed to airborne extraction knowing it was a stretch. Dre and 2 senior agents moved with Lewis to the motor pool and waited for a corridor. Rowe coordinated with the driver and watched exterior feeds. I stayed in the situation room to chase permissions, flight plan fragments, and any contact that could move an aircraft. We all knew the paperwork might not arrive, but movement bought time. The president agreed to blood draws and samples. Lewis supervised, sealed a vial, and sent a tech to process immediately. He said, "Preliminary indicators within the hour. If the markers show infection, we treat as exposure and restrict movement." The president stayed still and stoic, eyes on the ceiling. We accepted the obligation his silence put on us. Reports came in fragments. A traffic camera showed stalled cars and people on foot. State police closed bridges after looting and small fires. A helicopter cut in with a weather check, then nothing. I kept calling Andrews. Answers stayed partial. The defense liaison finally said, "You can attempt extraction. I cannot guarantee runway status. If you launch and the airframe cannot refuel and return, you risk the crew and the asset." We were choosing with no data. At the motor pool, Dre reported, "Vehicle ready. Route to the south gate. Rolling escort. Andrews says fuel trucks 5 miles out but stalled." I told her to hold for my signal and move blacked out. "Copy. Standing by." The situation room filled again. The chief of staff wanted a recorded address in case the feed died. The president refused to pre-record defeat. He told me quietly, "If I leave, I need to know my family is safe." I had no update. Staff pressed for a timeline. I gave a moving estimate based on the last confirmations. It comforted no one. We prepped the armored vehicle. It had a fortified cabin, independent power, and comms off-grid. The president rode with Lewis and the med team. Dre and 2 agents took the lead. 2 more vehicles and a pickup with a heavy mount formed the escort. I marked bottlenecks and alternates with Rowe. We would leave when Andrews confirmed fuel trucks could push to the runway and hold a clearance. The maintenance lead finally sent, "We can hold 5 minutes upon arrival. Fuel trucks will move if you make the approach now." Thin, but actionable. I gave the orders. We moved out blacked out. 2 agents on the lead roof scanned for movement. The drive to the south gate slowed for disabled cars, and smoke from 2 blocks over. People moved the other way on foot. Some waved, others stared. A state checkpoint refused to open until higher orders arrived. The motorcade commander negotiated over the line. After codes and documentation, the officer moved the barricade. We pushed on. 40 minutes in, a support vehicle reported large civilian groups on the southern approach to Andrews and a burning vehicle at an underpass. Dre called a stop to reassess. We huddled by the armored cabin. The president asked, "Are we still on schedule?" Lewis said, "If we clear the next checkpoint, yes. If not, we hold." The president touched the bandage once and looked away. We cleared the state checkpoint on priority codes and pushed to Andrews. A black plume rose from the north side. A pilot radioed that the ramp was a mess and crews were throwing fuel at compromised aircraft to get them off before the perimeter closed. His voice broke into static. The maintenance lead said his crew had 10 minutes or they would abort. I told the driver to move faster and had Rowe open the access gate remotely. Andrews was chaos. Refueling trucks stalled, drivers running toward a command post, crews pushing toward aircraft. At the checkpoint, a maintenance lead verified our manifest and waved us in after a curt clearance. Lewis radioed his techs to stand by. I walked the president to the aircraft. He moved steady but guarded. We lifted him aboard. The interior was set, medical bay arranged, cabin sealed, order in the middle of motion. Inside the aircraft, the med team strapped the president into a secure seat and began monitoring vitals. Captain Lewis leaned toward me and said, "We'll retest and move to the isolation bay. If the panels are clean, we take him immediately." He tapped a small portable monitor and watched the lines. At that moment, I watched the noise at the ramp through the open fuselage door. Men running, figures moving in odd ways, a helicopter with a rotor damaged squatting on the far pad. Then, a distant boom rolled through the concrete like a dying drum. A crewman shouted and pointed. Across the tarmac, a helicopter that had been preparing for takeoff lurched, tilted, and then struck the ground hard. Flames and black smoke roiled as personnel scattered. The pilot's microphone kept emitting a high, broken sound, and then stopped entirely. For the first time since the morning, a cold clarity spread through the plane. Arrival had been harder than we estimated, and now an incoming wave of events was reconfiguring everything. The engines whined up to a steady pitch as the cabin sealed, and the ramp door began to close. Through the narrowing gap, the last thing I saw outside was one of the crew chiefs waving his arms toward a group of mechanics who were still sprinting across the tarmac toward a burning helicopter. The fire had spread fast, fuel pooling under the tail and catching wind. The black smoke drifted low over the runway and blew back toward the hangars. When the hydraulic door locked shut, the sound of the chaos outside dulled to a low, steady hum. The crew moved down the aisle, checking latches and oxygen valves. The air smelled of disinfectant and metal, and the temperature inside dropped as the aircraft's environmental systems kicked in. I took my seat near the rear of the main cabin beside Captain Lewis, while the president sat opposite us in the isolation bay, an enclosed space separated by transparent panels and a sealed door. Lewis adjusted his headset and radioed the cockpit for confirmation of cabin pressure and flight status. The co-pilot responded that we were cleared for immediate ascent and expected to reach cruising altitude in 12 minutes. Lewis muttered a short acknowledgement and leaned back. The president sat upright, arms on the armrests, watching the floor as if thinking through each step of what would happen next. His jacket was off, sleeves rolled to the elbows, the dressing on his forearms still clean and white. He asked, "How long until we can make contact with the Pentagon?" Lewis told him we'd have full uplink once we were above the weather line. I said I would confirm ground status and re-establish communication with the command net as soon as the aircraft stabilized. The president nodded, still looking down. He didn't ask if his family had been reached. That subject had shifted into silence. When the wheels lifted from the runway, the aircraft gave a slight pull backward. The engines roared, and the vibration traveled up through the floor into my boots. I checked my watch and noted the time of departure. We banked hard to the east to avoid the smoke column rising over the base. The sudden tilt made a few of the medtechs grab onto the overhead rails, but no one spoke. The airfield fell away below us, its lights flickering in uneven clusters, and beyond that the city lay under a brown haze. Fires burned across several blocks, tiny orange spots among the grey. The Potomac reflected the glow like a slow-moving vein of light. For a brief second, everything looked distant, unreal, like we had already left the country behind. At 20,000 feet, Lewis checked the monitors again. The president's heart rate was steady, oxygen normal, blood pressure within acceptable range. The bandage showed no fresh bleeding. Lewis made a note and said superficial abrasions were unlikely to transmit anything without open exposure. I said, "He was inside the bunker when the breach happened." He answered, "Then the risk is minimal." He kept watching the numbers. I checked the cockpit. Colonel Ames kept us low for fuel and interference. Radios buzzed with broken signals. One command relay claimed offert, told us to hold course and wait. No one offered a landing zone. I did not pass that on. The cabin lights dimmed as we leveled. Medtech sorted vials. Lewis sat beside me and said he wanted to repeat the test in an hour. He added, "He keeps rubbing his arm, more inflamed than it should be. Could be stress. Could be contamination." I asked if it could move that fast. "Nothing normal spreads that fast." Light turbulence woke anyone dozing. The president asked for water and a ground update. I told him nothing solid yet. He said, "We can't stay up here forever." I agreed. 15 minutes later, a tech reported inconsistent readings, enzymes off pattern. Lewis sealed the isolation door and lifted the dressing. Redness had spread. Veins at the elbow were darker. He cleaned and redressed, came back with a face that said, calculation he did not want to state. He said, "It's changing faster than it should. We'll administer a broad-spectrum antiviral and a sedative to reduce systemic response." I asked if it would help. "It's better than waiting." He injected the meds. The president asked for a moment alone. We stepped back. Lewis requested a landing at Wright-Patterson. Said filters had maybe 12 hours. I asked about declaring a medical emergency. "Not yet. It draws attention. If he's positive, quarantine is the only safe action, and we're in a sealed tube." 2 hours later, we descended through storm cloud, lights flickering. The president sat lower, skin pale, forehead damp. He said, "It's not just a scratch." Lewis drew another sample. The blood looked dark and sluggish. He sealed it and said, "We'll check again. Could be stress or medication." He didn't sound convinced. Radar showed fast-moving unknowns along a perimeter road below. The pilot held altitude. Lewis stared at the new readings and said softly, "If this continues, systemic failure within an hour." The president stared at his hands and asked nothing. Lewis pushed everyone but essential crew forward, told me to stay by the chamber. He said to the president, "We're going to help you rest. You're under strain." He gave the sedative. Heart rate slowed, breathing evened. The engines hummed. An hour passed. Fuel ran low. Command stayed silent. I cleared diversion to the field near Dayton. During descent, the med team called again. The heart rate spiked despite sedation. Neck veins stood out. Breathing came in bursts. Lewis ordered more sedative, then restraints. We locked the chamber as the body thrashed. Alarms rose until a tech muted them. I told Lewis to back away. He kept trying to secure the IV. The president lunged, strength wrong for his size, and bit into Lewis's sleeve before the techs pulled him out and slammed the door. We watched through the glass as the president's body went still, then convulsed once more. The heart monitor flatlined. Lewis stood with his hand pressed to his forearm, blood seeping through the fabric. He looked at me, face blank, and said, "Get us on the ground now." I radioed the cockpit, told them to land immediately. The pilot said we were already approaching the runway. Through the window, I saw the first flash of lights from the base perimeter and the grey stretch of asphalt below. The president lay motionless inside the chamber. The rest of us stood outside, waiting for the engines to slow, knowing that whatever we touched next would change everything again. The wheels hit the tarmac hard, jolting the entire fuselage. The crew shouted through the intercom that reverse thrusters were engaged, but the aircraft still shook as if the ground itself resisted the landing. The interior lights flickered twice, and a few ceiling panels rattled loose before the motion leveled. The engines roared down to a steady whine, and the smell of burned fuel filled the cabin. We were on the ground, but no one moved. Every face turned toward the isolation chamber, where the president's body remained slumped against the straps. The heart monitor line was flat and red, the steady hum of the aircraft replacing the sound of his pulse. Lewis leaned back against the wall, breathing through his teeth. The bite mark on his arm had already soaked through the sleeve. I told him to sit down, but he stayed on his feet, jaw clenched, eyes locked on the chamber. He whispered, "We have to contain it before we open that door." I nodded, pulled the emergency kit from the wall, and tossed him a sterile bandage roll. He pressed it against the wound, but the bleeding didn't slow. His skin was already pale under the cabin light. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, saying we were on a secured strip near Wright-Patterson, but couldn't confirm any visual contact with ground personnel. Communications were down, and the control tower wasn't responding. He asked if we still had the primary package secured. I looked toward the chamber. The body was still motionless. I keyed the mic and said, "Maintain lockdown. Do not open the fuselage until I confirm internal status." The pilot said he'd keep engines idling, then cut the line. Lewis staggered once, caught himself on a seat, and said, "If we don't isolate the entire cabin, this aircraft becomes a vector. Everything we brought in, everything we touched, it's compromised." His voice had started to drift between calm and panic. I told him to focus, to stay conscious, and that we'd call for ground medical once we confirmed the perimeter was safe. He shook his head and said quietly, "You still don't get it. If that body reanimates, there is no safe." The phrase settled in my chest before the sound reached my ears. I turned toward the glass just in time to see the faintest twitch in the president's right hand. The movement was small, just 2 fingers curling inward, but it was enough. The medtech nearest the chamber screamed for Lewis, who stumbled forward but stopped short of the sealed door. Inside, the body shuddered once more, a low, guttural sound leaking through the walls that didn't sound like breathing. The technician backed away until he hit the bulkhead. I reached for my pistol, chambered around, and took position in front of the glass. The president, or whatever was left of him, began to move. His head tilted upward in a slow, jerking motion. Eyes open but glassy, the pupils clouded to a milky grey. His mouth opened, not in speech but in reflex, a hollow gasp that made a soft clicking sound through his teeth. The restraints creaked as his muscles tightened. His skin was pallid, stretched thin. I shouted for the techs to stay back, then told Lewis to seal the secondary barrier. He was already moving toward the control panel, his bandaged arm shaking. He slammed the emergency latch, and the isolation bay sealed completely with a hydraulic hiss. We stood there watching through the reinforced glass as the thing inside struggled against the restraints. There was no confusion about what we were seeing anymore. It wasn't a seizure. It wasn't residual movement. It was animation without consciousness, violence without purpose. Lewis said in a low, flat voice, "That's it, full transition." He turned toward me, his eyes glassy, and I knew he understood what his own wound meant. The president's head snapped violently to one side, the sound dull and mechanical. He jerked forward, pulling at the straps with inhuman strength. The steel fittings began to bend. The medtech screamed again, but no one moved closer. Lewis stumbled against the wall, breathing hard. I told him to stay down, but he pointed toward the controls and said, "If it breaks out, it'll get us all. We can't land this thing if it's still breathing." I ordered the pilot to cut engines and keep the cabin sealed. The aircraft slowed, coasting along the runway until the engines idled into silence. Lewis pressed the intercom and spoke directly to the cockpit. His voice was weak but steady. "Shut down power to the isolation bay. Don't open the hatch until I say so." The pilot acknowledged, and the lights inside the bay dimmed. The creature, or the man who used to be the president, let out a deep, guttural noise that vibrated through the glass. It strained against the harness again, and this time the metal snapped. One arm came free, then the other. The body leaned forward, hitting the glass with enough force to make it shudder. I drew my weapon and aimed for the center of the forehead. Lewis nodded once, understanding the order without needing it spoken. He keyed in the manual override and vented the air pressure between the chambers. The door popped open with a metallic click. The smell that came through was foul, decay mixed with antiseptic. The figure lunged forward, teeth bared, and I fired twice in rapid succession. Both rounds hit square. The head jerked back, but the body kept moving for another second before collapsing into the corner of the chamber. Silence followed. The medtech stayed frozen in place. Lewis dropped to his knees beside the wall, holding his wounded arm. He looked up at me and said, "Now you understand." His voice cracked on the last word. I reloaded mechanically, not because I needed to, but because movement felt safer than thought. The cockpit called in, asking if the situation was contained. I answered, "Contained for now." Then I told them to keep the ramp sealed until we finished quarantine. Lewis asked for a clean blade and antiseptic. I knew what he was thinking before he said it. He looked down at his arm, then back at me. "I can slow it down," he said, "if I do it early enough." I told him no, that we could stabilize him until we reached a base facility, but he shook his head and laughed once, a dry sound. You saw how fast it worked on him. He stood unsteady, reached for the medkit, and pulled out a scalpel. Before I could stop him, he tightened his belt around his upper arm and pressed the blade into the flesh just below the bite. The sound was quick and wet. He didn't scream. He just kept cutting until the blood stopped flowing freely. When it was done, he pressed a dressing over the wound and tied it with a strip of gauze. His face was ashen, but he was still lucid. "If I turn, shoot me," he said. I told him I would. Outside the plane, the runway lights flickered erratically. The storm that had chased us south had reached the base. Rain streaked down the windshield, each drop catching the reflection of the engine glow. The pilot reported that the radio was dead and all tower frequencies were silent. Through the forward glass, I could see the distant silhouettes of hangars, but no ground vehicles, no welcoming crew, just darkness and the faint glimmer of wet concrete. We were alone on the field. I gathered the surviving personnel in the cabin and gave orders. We would remain aboard until dawn. No one opened external hatches. No one touched the body again. We'd formed 2-man watches, one at the cockpit, one in the rear. The medtechs cleaned up the blood, sealed the chamber, and began spraying disinfectant across every surface. Lewis sat near the bulkhead, pale and sweating, his arm trembling under the bandage. He said, "You think anyone's left down there?" I told him we'd find out when the sun came up. He didn't argue. Hours passed in slow fragments. Rain turned to sleet, then back to rain. The air inside the cabin grew stale and heavy. The power fluctuated once, and we switched to auxiliary lighting. Every sound carried weight: the creak of a panel, the hiss of the ventilation system, the occasional low moan from the wind outside. At some point near dawn, Lewis stopped answering when I spoke to him. I walked over and found him slumped forward, breathing shallow. His pulse was rapid, his skin grey. I checked his pupils. They didn't react to light. I knew what came next. I called the techs forward and told them to prepare another isolation zone. They hesitated. I could see it in their faces. They didn't want to do it again. I gave the order a second time, louder. They obeyed. We moved Lewis into a smaller compartment near the rear galley and locked the door. He regained consciousness briefly as we carried him. He whispered, "Burn the plane if I change." I didn't answer. When the door shut, his breathing slowed, then stopped entirely. For 10 long minutes, we waited outside the door, staring at the steel handle. Then we heard the sound we were all expecting, the scraping of nails against metal from the other side. The techs looked at me, waiting for instruction. My weapon felt heavy in my hands. I said, "We keep the seal. No one opens that door." One of the younger medics started to cry quietly. I told him to pull himself together and return to his post. There was no space left for emotion. Survival had replaced everything else. When morning finally came, the rain stopped. The sky was a dull silver, the kind of light that hides distance. We still had no signal, no contact from any base authority. The runway stretched into the fog ahead of us. Empty. I walked to the cockpit and scanned the horizon through the glass. A line of abandoned trucks sat along the access road. The pilot asked what we were going to do. I looked back toward the sealed compartments and said, "We're not taking this plane anywhere." That was the moment the mission ended. The president was dead, the chain of command broken, and what remained of the crew sat in silence, waiting for orders that would never come. The infection had moved faster than any of us could have imagined, and now it was inside the very symbol of the nation's survival. I gave the only command that made sense anymore. We would seal the aircraft, transmit one final coded message on the emergency band, and then abandon it. Captain Lewis had been right. If it spread here, the plane itself would become a weapon. We prepared to move on foot once the weather cleared. Before leaving, I went to the isolation chamber one last time. Through the reinforced glass, the former president's body still twitched in brief mechanical spasms. His eyes were open, unfocused. There was no humanity left there. I stared at him for a long time, remembering the first morning briefing when he'd told us to keep calm, to believe the system would hold. Then I closed the inner seal, armed the thermal charge, and turned away. When I stepped down the ramp into the cold morning air, the wind carried the smell of jet fuel and rain-soaked concrete. I could see the empty hangars in the distance, doors hanging open, puddles reflecting the grey sky. The others followed in silence. Behind us, the engines were dead, the aircraft still and lifeless except for the faint sound of movement inside the fuselage. We started walking toward the access road, leaving behind the last piece of order we had known. The base stretched out around us in a kind of unnatural quiet. The wind pushed across the open tarmac, rolling dust and bits of torn paper that slapped against our boots. Every sound carried too far. The scuff of gear, the faint click of weapons, the dry creak of straps. The hangars stood like hollow shells, their interiors dark and echoing. A few burned-out trucks sat near the perimeter fence, glass shattered, tires melted flat. We moved slow, scanning corners, calling soft checks through our radios, even though no one was left to answer. The fog hadn't lifted entirely, and the horizon disappeared into grey light. I kept my rifle low but ready. Beside me, Roe adjusted his sling and said quietly, "Feels wrong walking away from it." I didn't respond. He wasn't wrong, but there was no value in saying it out loud. The airfield access road curved along a drainage ditch, leading toward a maintenance compound that looked mostly intact. We decided to check it for supplies and a working vehicle. The asphalt was slick from the earlier rain, and a thin trail of smoke drifted from somewhere behind the control tower. When we reached the compound gate, it was already hanging open. A single security truck sat with the driver's door ajar and the engine dead. The inside smelled of gun oil and something sour. I found a radio handset on the dash, but the battery light was dead. I tossed it aside and motioned for the team to clear the building. Inside, the office had been abandoned mid-shift. Papers were scattered across the floor, coffee cups still half full, chairs overturned. A large map of the eastern United States hung crooked on the wall with red circles drawn around major cities: Washington, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Chicago. The circles weren't random, they were dated. The earliest was 3 days before the outbreak hit the news. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the handwriting near the bottom of the map. It wasn't notes. It was a short instruction written in black marker: containment viable for 72 hours max. I called Dre over, pointed at the date. She exhaled and said, "They knew." I nodded once. We moved deeper into the compound, past the offices into the maintenance bay. A generator still hummed in the corner, running on the last of its fuel. The lights above flickered but held. In one of the lockers, I found a sealed case marked CBRN Response Tier 2. Inside were hazmat suits, respirators, and chemical sensors, all standard issue for biological containment. The seals were unbroken. Someone had prepared to act, but no one had deployed. That realization hit harder than any weapon could. Dre checked the equipment and said, "We could use these if we find survivors." I told her to keep them packed for now. Our priority was transport. We located a fuel truck with half a tank and a Humvee parked beside it. The keys were in the ignition. The battery turned over slow, then caught. Ro cheered under his breath. We loaded our remaining gear into the back and topped off the tank. The plan was simple: head west toward Dayton and try to make contact with any remaining command structure. I climbed into the passenger seat while Dre drove. The road beyond the gate was cracked and lined with debris. Bodies lay scattered along the ditch, some in uniform, others in civilian clothing. All of them were still. None looked recent. The Humvee rolled forward in silence for nearly 10 minutes before anyone spoke. Ro broke it. He asked if we should have taken Lewis's body with us. I said no, that he'd made his choice. Dre kept her eyes on the road and said, "If this spreads the way we saw, it won't matter who you were or what badge you carried. The infection doesn't care." Her voice was steady, but her hands gripped the wheel too tight. I told her to keep driving. The GPS unit flickered between dead coordinates, occasionally showing ghost pings of nearby bases that no longer existed. We stopped once to refuel at a small depot outside the perimeter. It looked recently used. Fuel lines coiled neatly, a clipboard left on the desk with a list of vehicles. The last entry read, "Evac convoy, White House personnel." No times, no return mark. I felt a cold weight in my stomach. That convoy never arrived. Somewhere out there, between the city and this base, those people disappeared. I turned the page, saw another note scrawled in pencil. "Do not open Hangar 5. Airborne trace confirmed." The handwriting was shaky. I tore the page out and kept it in my pocket. When we reached the far end of the airfield, Hangar 5 stood out immediately. Its doors were chained but slightly ajar, enough for wind to whistle through. The air smelled faintly of bleach and something metallic. Dre wanted to check inside. I hesitated but nodded. We opened the doors carefully, guns raised. The interior was colder than the air outside. Rows of body bags lined the floor, dozens of them, each tagged with a red label marked "Priority Quarantine." A small desk sat near the corner with a laptop still running on reserve battery power. The screen displayed a series of medical logs. The last entry read, "Subject B14, neurological activity persists after cardiac death. Recommendation, terminate project and destroy remaining samples." The timestamp was 12 hours before we landed. Ro muttered a curse under his breath and asked who authorized this. I scrolled through the logs and found a signature line. Dr. C. Henley, CDC liaison, White House directive. It wasn't a rogue experiment. It was federal. They'd been studying infected subjects before the collapse reached DC. Dre leaned over my shoulder and whispered, "They were trying to weaponize it." I didn't answer. Maybe they were trying to cure it. Maybe they were doing both. Either way, they lost control. We left the hangar and sealed it again, chaining the doors shut. The wind had shifted, carrying the distant echo of gunfire somewhere north of the base. Not close, but enough to remind us the world beyond the fence was still burning. I told the team to load back up. As we drove out through the outer checkpoint, Dre asked where we'd go next. I said west, toward higher ground, somewhere with visibility and distance. She asked if I believed any central government still existed. I thought about the empty radios, the silent bases, the president lying dead in a burned aircraft. Then I said, "There's always someone left. Maybe not what we recognize, but someone." By midday, we reached the edge of the base property. The main highway was blocked by a pileup of military vehicles and civilian cars, all abandoned in tight formation like people had tried to build a barricade and failed. We picked a route through the shoulder, bumping over debris, keeping the speed low. The world around us was grey and colourless, the sky thick with low clouds. A gas station stood ahead, its sign half broken, canopy collapsed. I called a stop so we could check for supplies. Inside, the shelves were mostly empty, but there were boxes of bottled water behind the counter and a half-empty crate of canned food. We loaded what we could and refueled again. While we worked, a voice came through the radio. Faint, distorted, but unmistakably human. The transmission repeated a single line. All surviving federal units converge on Raven Rock. Continuity of government active. Do not bring infected personnel. The voice was male, calm, official. Dre stared at the radio, then at me. Raven Rock still operational? She asked. I shrugged. Or someone wants us to think it is. Either way, it was the first direction we'd had in 24 hours. We packed up and headed north. The trip to Raven Rock took the rest of the day. The roads were choked with wreckage, and several times we had to stop and clear debris just to pass. By evening, we reached the foothills. The sky was the color of ash. The mountain entrance was exactly where the map said it would be. Though most of the outer structures were burned or collapsed, the reinforced gate to the complex itself was still closed, streaked with soot and rust. A small light flickered above the keypad, meaning power still ran inside. I keyed in the presidential emergency override code. The panel buzzed, then accepted. The gate began to open, slow and heavy, revealing a dark tunnel beyond. Inside, the air was dry and stale. Emergency lights glowed along the walls, casting long shadows. We drove in until the gate closed behind us, sealing out the wind. The tunnel led to a secondary blast door, already half open. The tracks of vehicles marked the floor, fresh enough to suggest recent movement. We dismounted and entered on foot. The inner corridor smelled faintly of disinfectant and fuel. On the wall, someone had written a message in black paint. No entry without clearance, level red. The spelling was wrong. That's what made it real. The people here hadn't been bureaucrats. They'd been survivors. We moved slowly through the halls, weapons raised. The bunker had power, but it was fading. The lights dimmed every few seconds before stabilizing. The control room was empty, though the monitors were still on, showing static and half-loaded data screens. One showed satellite imagery of the East Coast. Every major city was marked red. Only 2 areas blinked green, Cheyenne Mountain and this site. Dre exhaled sharply. So they're still out there, I said. Maybe, or those are just old signals that haven't died yet. A noise from down the corridor froze us all, a metallic clatter followed by footsteps. I motioned for silence and aimed down the hall. A figure stepped into the light wearing a torn hazmat suit, face hidden behind a cracked visor. The person raised one hand and said through a distorted speaker, "Don't shoot, you're late." The voice was tired, unmistakably human. We lowered our weapons slowly. The figure pulled off the helmet. It was a woman in her 40s, hair matted, face pale but alert. She looked at my badge and said, "Secret Service, so the president didn't make it." I said nothing. Her expression told me she already knew. She introduced herself as Dr. Henley, the same name from the hangar logs. She said she'd been part of the containment task force before the evacuation failed. According to her, Raven Rock had been compromised 2 nights ago. Only a handful of staff survived, and they sealed off most of the lower levels. She pointed toward the control room and said, "Communications are limited, but the Western network still runs. Cheyenne's active. They're coordinating survivors across military installations. You're standing in what's left of the government." We followed her into a smaller command center, where a few people worked quietly at consoles. The air was thick with exhaustion. A large map on the wall displayed scattered survivor clusters across the country, most of them small, isolated, blinking slowly as data refreshed. Henley said, "The infection overwhelmed the cities faster than any model predicted. The incubation period shortened. Airborne vectors were limited, but panic spread faster than the pathogen. People fled quarantine zones before we could secure them. You saw the result." She looked at me. "You were with the president. How far did he make it?" I said. "He made it to the airfield. Didn't survive the flight." Henley didn't react with surprise, only resignation. She said quietly, "Then continuity transfers to command authority. You realize what that means, Agent Kincaid?" I nodded. It meant the chain of succession had ended in mid-air, and whatever was left would now be run from this bunker by whoever still had a pulse. She turned to one of the operators and told them to log the event as confirmed. Then she faced me again. "We'll need you to brief what's left of central coordination. You're one of the last first-hand witnesses." I spent the next 2 hours recounting everything: the initial outbreak reports, the lockdown at the White House, the bunker breach, the infection on the plane. Every detail went into the log. When I finished, Henley asked what orders the president had given before his death. I told her the truth. He'd said to get him airborne, to preserve the continuity of government. She nodded once and said, "Then that's what we'll do, just not in the way he meant." She gestured toward the radio array. "We can still transmit on shortwave. If we can't save the system, we can keep the idea of it alive." That night, I stood outside the bunker entrance, looking toward the fog that covered the valley below. The air was cold and sharp. The others were inside, checking equipment, planning broadcasts, trying to rebuild meaning from ruins. Somewhere out there, other survivors might be doing the same, building small pockets of structure in the middle of collapse. I thought of Lewis, of the president, of the city we'd left burning behind us. None of it felt like history. It still felt close, unfinished. Dre joined me on the catwalk, carrying her rifle slung over her shoulder. She looked out at the horizon where the clouds glowed faintly with reflected firelight. She said, "You think anyone will remember how this started?" I said, "Someone will. That's the point of writing it down." She nodded, silent for a long time. Then she said, "What happens now?" I looked back toward the bunker, where the faint hum of generators echoed through the hall. Now we make sure the next voice that speaks for this country tells the truth. When the night deepened, I walked back inside and recorded my report. The tape would be stored with the others in the archive, labeled with date and classification. My voice sounded distant in the playback, stripped of emotion. But that was fine. Emotion wouldn't rebuild anything. Facts might. When I finished, I marked the log. Day 1 of continuity command. Then I shut the recorder off and sat there for a long while, listening to the silence that followed. Outside, the wind moved through the hills, carrying with it the last echoes of a world that had already ended. Inside, a few of us kept working under the dull light, writing new protocols, drafting lists, maintaining the illusion of order. Maybe that was all continuity meant now, the act of continuing, even when nothing remained to continue for. And that's where we'll stop for now. Thanks for listening till the end. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me how the story hit you, what moments worked, what didn't, and what you'd want to hear next. And a big thank you to everyone supporting the channel, especially with extra membership: Carlos Herrera, Luca Mod, The Great Anywho, Jaydala, Madam Midnight, Deborah Powell. You keep this project alive. Until next time, Survivor. Jack's Nightmares signing off.